Next up to the stage, I asked Dave Hughes last night, do I need to move this on? How he'd like to be introduced. He just said, as partner of privacy and cybersecurity at Eversheds Sutherland, but I had to add he's a fancy football legend, loves Liverpool and has a slight dislike of Leeds United. Anyway, here we go, over to Dave Hughes.
Thanks, John. It's nothing specific against Leeds United, just really don't like them, so I'm sorry if you're a Leeds fan. Right, okay, so I've got about 20 minutes-ish to talk about, well, the law, which isn't the easiest thing to talk about to a room full of people who may not be lawyers. If I say the acronym GDPR to you, normally I get about a 5 to 10% reduction in the number of people actually still in the room. So bear with me, and I promise I will try and take you on a very whistle-stop journey through pretty much everything I do and tell you why it's relevant. If you haven't heard of Eversheds Sutherland, which might be fair given we don't have offices in Norfolk anymore, we're one of the 10 largest law firms in the world. We've got 70 offices in over 30 countries, and we have the biggest privacy and cybersecurity team in the country. Okay, so my agenda, it's reasonably practical. Why should you listen to this? Seems an entirely fair question. Not that you have a lot of choice, but it seems like a fair question. What does it mean in practice to talk about practical data protection compliance and security breaches, and how should we respond when things go wrong? Although you've already heard a chunk about that from both John and Lee previously. I should also say, because Lee made the very good point that, we do hear about more breaches from smaller organizations, but I can tell you, although I can't tell you the details, the reason you don't hear about breaches for very large organizations sometimes is people like me, but I do have some cracking breach stories that I can tell you when I'm not on the microphone. Okay, so why should you listen to me? Well, there are a few different answers as to why data protection is important and why GDPR matters. And as someone who was into data protection, I've worked in this area for 18 years, which means when I said I wanted to be a privacy lawyer, no one cared about privacy. People would ask me from time to time, Dave, is this lawful? I would say no, and people would do it anyway. And the law has changed quite a lot since then. So the sensationalist answer to why listen to me is that every single time you get GDPR wrong, you're on the hook for up to a 4% of global annual turnover fine per breach or £17.5 million per breach, whichever is higher. So big numbers. The honest answer, and lawyers don't say this a lot for reasons I'll let you figure out yourself, is that fines are actually quite unlikely if you've made an effort. If you've made no effort, then the fines are there to show people that if you don't make an effort, you're going to get in lots of trouble. But if you've made an effort, if you've spoken to organizations like Breakwater, like others, to understand your risk, to show that you're trying to do something about it, to create a roadmap in areas where maybe you aren't perfect, that will get you a long way discussing with the regulator. What I tend to find is the bigger risk isn't the threat of a fine, it's the threat of a claim from every single affected individual. Because no matter, and I don't want to be too cynical here, but no matter what breach you have, you will find it causes an inordinate amount of distress and loss to a wide range of people. That may be real loss, or it might be entirely made up loss, but it depends on the nature of the breach. I think, and we'll come on to litigation culture at the end. But actually, that's really important because the risk that pervades all of this isn't just if you get it wrong. It's how many people you affect, how badly they take it, which to be honest comes down to how they feel about it more than what the law actually says you've done, and how keen they are to go to dubious law firms and try and fleece you for money. Because in the biggest data breaches I've seen, and I work for large international, multinational retailers, international tech providers, some of the largest social media and online marketplace clients in the world, the biggest issue is that everyone wants money from you. And the cost of living crisis is not helping that. So you will find if you have breaches and people find out about it, regardless of what you've done, you'll get sued. That's not my fault, just to be clear, but you probably will. And it's not even the cost of paying those people to make them go away or to settle their compensation or to make them feel better again. It's the cost of everything else that goes into settling those claims, going to court, dealing with lawyers. I know, not great. All of that becomes very expensive very quickly. So actually, for a lot of my clients, it's not the fines that are a concern. It's dealing with the individuals who are affected. And that is one of the reasons why people like me make sure people don't hear about these kinds of breaches unless they really have to. Because as soon as we tell people, 10, 20% of those people will send you a letter of claim and ask you for £10,000 to £15,000 each, probably. We'll send some very direct letters back saying, jog on, more professionally. but you'll still get them. So what the heck is practical compliance? I hope I've slightly convinced you. Well, one, I know what I'm talking about, and two, what I'm talking about is reasonably important. So what's practical compliance? And the subline here is important. When it's impossible to fully comply with the law, what do? It is impossible to comply with GDPR in full. Absolutely impossible. And I have to be careful here because there might be IT providers who use this in their marketing. But if someone says, I fully comply with GDPR, just have a conversation with them about that. And I'll tell you in what way in a second. You will all be hugely disappointed to know I'm not going to talk to you about every single data protection principle. But essentially on the slide is everything you should be doing every time anyone in your organization looks at any information on a living individual on a screen. I really want to go through it, but you'll hate me for it, so I can't. But just pulling out some of those principles as to why what I've said about my area of law being impossible to fully comply with. So, data accuracy. So if you hold information on living people, I'd be really surprised if you don't. You've really cracked automation if you don't. So if you hold information on living people and they move house or change bank accounts and they haven't told you, you're in breach of GDPR. The level of harassment and creepy stalking that would be required to make sure you know every single thing about every single person and it's up to date at all times, which I am not recommending, is insane. You cannot comply with the fourth data protection principle. It is fundamentally impossible. Storage limitation is don't keep data for longer than you need it. Data minimization in 3. I'm jumping around to keep you paying attention, sorry. Those two come together to mean that you should never collect more data than you need, and you should never keep data for longer than you need it. Now, with a host of IT professionals in the room, I have to be careful what I say about data deletion, but it is very difficult to do securely. And collecting only what you need is almost flat out impossible. If you give people, staff, customers, suppliers, anyone, a free text box to answer pretty much any question you ask them, you will occasionally get someone like my dad who comes along and tells you about his time growing up in Liverpool, regardless of what the question was. He's probably doing it in Slido right now. There is very little way you can fully comply with those things because you can't control people. All of the risk, John said earlier, the best technology can be undone by people. All of the risk here, if you have good technology, comes from people. The law at the bottom there, the one I've put in bold, which I am going to talk about because it is relevant, you have to put in place, if you were a controller of personal data, so that's anyone with employees, anyone with customers, anyone who holds personal information about living individuals, you have to put in place appropriate technical and organizational security measures. Technical measures, probably preaching to the choir in relation to what they are. Organizational measures means have people who know what they're doing. It doesn't matter if you have great security if you have people who fundamentally ignore it. And likewise, it doesn't matter if you have great people if your security is at that 15% mark that John showed earlier. Lee looked at people and technology and support and different facets of bringing together effective security. If you only take away one slide, including mine, that is the one to take away. They have to work in tandem. And also what Lee said about security breaches being impossible to avoid is true. I think Lee said, and I wrote it down because it was great, 76% of organizations over 5 years have had a breach that has some financial impact. I almost guarantee you that that's 100%. It's just the other 24% didn't realize it. I deal with these every single day. Oh, I want to talk about the law, but never mind. Keep going, Dave. So what are the requirements around breaches? I'm going to tell you a very small amount of the law. I'm not going to quote any sections at you, I promise. So there are two types of roles in data protection, controllers and processors. Hands up if you know the difference between controllers and processors. Okay, that's some people. That's good. So a controller is an organization that makes decisions about how and for what purposes personal data are used. If you have employees, you are a controller of their data, unless you let them run amok, which I wouldn't recommend. Processors are service providers. So if you provide IT solutions, if you are a vendor or a supplier, and you have access to other people's personal data, other businesses' personal data, and you process it under a contract in line with their instructions, not your own autonomous decisions, you're a processor. You might be both. But the laws apply in different ways to both. So if you are a controller, if it's your data and you decide how it's used, if there is unauthorized loss, destruction, or access to personal data, you have 72 hours to report that to the regulator from the moment you become aware of it. if it hits the threshold for reporting. Now, that threshold for reporting is that there has to be some material prejudice ongoing to the people affected. And what that means in my world is that what you do in the 72 hours, or if we're honest, given most reporting standards, the 12 hours you have between when your staff member tells you about it and when you actually have to report it, you need to get that data back under control as quickly as you can. And your systems and your governance and internal operational processes there are crucial. Every day, people send emails to the wrong people. Every single one of those is a legal security breach because it permits unauthorized access to personal data. Some of those, people sending their emails to their mums, not a huge deal most of the time. Some of those, sending all the health data that a particular client has ever received in an encrypted format through a link to all the taxi firms in the area, actually happened. Quite a lot more serious. Different spectrum, I grant you. So, those things happen sort of every day, and often on a Friday, often at Saturday, 1 in the morning, as John said. So the business, your clients, if you're a supplier, or your business, if you're a controller, need to know, one, that they're going to be told about that quickly. A lot of laptops and phones get lost on Friday nights. I'm sure in perfectly professional places, but they often get lost on Friday nights for one reason or another. If that happens, that means you as an organization have to report that to the ICO by 5 o'clock on Monday, which means if you don't find out about it till lunchtime on Monday, you're going to have to be bloody good at what you do to make that deadline. And why is that deadline important? Well, slightly back to the sensationalist answer, it's a 2% of global annual turnover fine or up to £8.5 million fine for being late on a notification, technically. Again, the honest answer is no one has ever been fined that. But it's a good way of incentivizing your employees to make sure they tell you when they're supposed to. I talked about litigation culture and the importance of, well, how do I make this sound like I'm not trying to just gag everyone from saying everything? The importance of only telling people about breaches when you really have to. And that's a difficult line to walk because Lee talked about some of the examples, and Pendragon was one of them, where actually being transparent can be really helpful in how you manage it. And that is absolutely correct, and I don't disagree with that. From my perspective, I would be looking at it as, if you need to be transparent, there are good and bad ways of doing it. Definitely seen both. But just be sure that you need to be transparent first. So the legal obligation to report is if there's a material prejudice likely to happen to the individuals. Individual reporting is a very similar threshold. If there is something they could do that might protect them from identity fraud or from some other impact or harm, then you're supposed to tell them. Don't tell people and don't report it to the regulator if you don't have to. And here is one area where, all jokes aside, lawyers can be really useful. It's important to report the things where you need to meet your legal obligations, but the ICO keeps a track of every single report you make. If you are reporting things, and this is really true more for non-cyber attacks, more for the organizational breaches, the emails to the wrong people, the letters to the wrong people. If you can get that back under control, and if you don't have an email that says, hey, we sent you this by mistake, can you just confirm you've deleted it, that you haven't shared it with anyone, and if you have, who you've shared it with, and that you won't do anything with it, you should have an email like that. Because if you send that out to everyone you've sent that email to in the wrong case, and they come back and say, yeah, fair enough, I've deleted it, I'm happy to agree with all that, you won't have to report it, and you won't have to tell anyone. Doesn't matter what you've sent, doesn't matter how serious it is. If you've sent it out, got it all back, and got confirmation from everyone that you sent it to that they won't do that, you won't have to report it legally, and you won't have to tell anyone. Given that if it's very sensitive information and you do tell them, i.e. you don't control it very quickly, and you legally do have to tell them and the regulator, you might be on the hook for a fine and a claim from every person affected. That's a huge swing in potential liability, risk, and reputational damage for your organization. So have a process here that works, and we'll come on to that in a bit. On the bottom there, I've talked about, if you haven't had experience of this, do wargaming, penetration testing, all the things that Lee and John have already talked about. And I really like the Mike Tyson quote as well, but if you haven't had a breach, I mean, bad news, you probably have and you don't realize it, but if you haven't had a breach, practice one. One, it's really good for the first time you fear that sheer panic of what the hell do I do now, to be when you're not facing lots of liability. Really is. And I suppose the other thing is just, it's quite a lot of fun. Doesn't sound like it, I know, but it is quite a lot of fun to just see where those areas of weakness are. Because people aren't perfect, and they're not expected to be perfect, but you can improve how they respond to things by testing them. That may not make you very popular, but I'm a privacy lawyer, so popularity is not really on my agenda. So what does practical compliance mean? I've talked to you about what the law is, but what does it actually mean? Well, it means bringing together those technical organizational measures. So having good security and having good policies and procedures and making sure people know what they are. The vast majority of breaches that come across my desk are unpatched IT or people doing something that's fundamentally daft or not in line with policies. And that comes to how often do you train them, what's your onboarding, how clear are your policies, how do you make people act in the way that you would like them to do. I had a breach Monday. Someone went in, they were a security officer, third-party provided, and took photos of the CCTV images and sent them to a friend, another security officer, same third-party security supplier, and said, watch out for this guy, he's a thief. Somehow, and funnily enough, no one is telling us how, those images got on 3 different social media platforms with the word thief, banned, and watch out for him. And so the customer came into my client and said, how did these 4 images of me claiming I'm a thief from your store get on social media? And my client had literally no idea. We're still trying to figure out, because funnily enough, when we asked the security guards what happened, they both said, I didn't do that, despite the CCTV footage we have of one of them doing it. So even if you have good processes, though they had been trained on not only what their employer wanted them to do, but what my client wanted them to do for CCTV and security, and they just ignored a lot of it. Both of them will be fired. They're very unlikely to ever work in security again doing things like that. But it doesn't matter how good your policies, procedures, and technology are if people fundamentally ignore it. If you haven't, and Lee and John will be able to talk to you more about this than I can, work through what you hold, how you get it. You know, keep in mind the Dave's dads of this world. What do you ask for? How do you get it? How do you control the data you acquire? How do you control when it's deleted? You can't, well, the right way to put this is you can't not have breaches. You're all going to have security breaches, but you can control how much data you hold and how lawful that data is, so that when you have a breach, it might be, you know, yes, there was a bad actor, back to Nicolas Cage, if there was a bad actor who accessed this data and we think we did everything we could. And I've said that to the ICO a lot. But I've also said to the ICO, yeah, there was 50 years worth of data here and 80% of it is stuff the business fundamentally doesn't need, and it's really quite damaging. So that's not the easiest conversation to have with the regulator. So yes, have security and yes, have training, but think about the data you actually hold. Because if you hold more than you should, and that's subject to a breach, again, even the best technology and the best policies aren't going to help you, because fundamentally you'll be legally non-compliant. What to do when it goes wrong and why is it always 4 p.m. on a Friday? I think, to be honest, other speakers, both John and Lee, have talked about this. We're working with clients far more often on cyber attacks, credential stuffing, ransomware. Really common. Most of the time, as I say, individual poor practices. I was talking to a few people before, and I explained that we had a cyber attack where we force-changed someone's password who'd been phished, so they'd got in using his user details. Someone really senior, and then the attackers got back in again, despite the fact we kicked them out and locked the password. Turned out he changed his password back to the original password. That's money well spent on lawyers, isn't it? We'll steal the whole thing again. But it's a team effort. So you need to know what your team is. You need to know what your external team is. If you have a serious cyber breach, it's going to be whatever your governance structure is, your InfoSec, your compliance, your legal teams, probably external lawyers, probably external forensic specialists, probably the police, NCSC, as Lee was talking about, action fraud might be involved. Know who you might need to contact. If you're separately regulated, if you're financial services or something else like that, you might have other reporting obligations as well. If your business has never thought through, do you know what, if something goes really badly wrong, who are we going to call? I'm trying not to make a Ghostbusters reference, but who are we going to bring to the table to solve these problems for us? If you don't know the answer to that, that's the best advice I can give you. Because when panic sets in, if you can put a team together, you'll be in a better place. Check your internal processes. So we talked about it always being Friday at 4 o'clock. Check that everyone in your business knows what a breach is. Not just what a cyber breach, what a ransomware attack looks like, what a data breach looks like. Emails to the wrong people, losing your laptop, losing your phone. All security breaches, all need to be logged internally, all need to be considered for reporting to the ICO. Every single person in your business needs to know that is a breach, I report it to Dave, and then that's all I have to do. Dave deals with everything else. But that is so important because if you miss it, by the time you get it under control, you'll have completely lost the ability to get the data back. You'll have completely lost the ability to report to the regulator or the individuals and the timescales that the law allows, and you will be really running uphill. And there's only so much, no matter how good your external lawyers are, there's only so much we can do to get you back from that. And this is the final slide, and I've talked about it already. So litigation culture, I just want to talk about, again, yes, the fines are important, and it's easy to terrify people and get people's attention at the start of a presentation with large numbers, which is exactly what I did, and I'm not sorry for that. But the threat that we are seeing is law firms, in quotes, gathering up a whole load of people. Have you ever had a security breach? What happened? Well, let's write to them, ask for 5 to 15 grand and see what happens. It's really, really common. And if you have a large number, particularly if you're an IT services provider and you look after data, you might have a huge number of people's data on your systems. That is a lot of liability. So it's important just to think about when you're managing your breaches, reverse engineer that risk rather than fines. What is our tactic? What is our strategic plan to limit the risk of future claims? And that's a mix of only telling people when you need to, being really transparent, as Lee said, frankly, being really nice when people are really mean to you quite a lot of the time to try and manage those expectations. But that will make a significant difference to your potential risk and legal liability when things go wrong. Okay, that's it. So there are questions at the end. I hope that was helpful. Any questions, let me know. Thanks.